Episode 123 of the Interpretation Station is called to order. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all doing? This is an episode specially for the French speakers among you. We're doing something a bit unusual today. As you'll know, for the most part of my Interpretation Station episodes, I tend to provide you with statements in the various languages that were delivered by the various delegations from various countries, okay? Now, there's another category of speakers, however, that you hear at the UN, certainly in Geneva, so at UNOG, that perhaps I haven't given enough time to, because it's not just delegations, obviously, that speak at the UN. It's also non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and the style, the delivery, the content is sometimes a little bit different to what the actual delegations say. Also, your average civil servant, your average ambassador, or your average delegate there for the various countries, they tend to have perhaps a slightly higher education level. I suppose public speaking is probably one of the things they're trained in when they go to little ambassadors' school. They're taught how to speak nicely and slowly. It's not always the case. Obviously, you get some bad eggs, but generally the delegates are fairly good speakers. Now, the people who come from the NGOs, now certainly the smaller NGOs, okay, the bigger ones like your Amnesty Internationals, your Human Rights Watch, I think they probably fall in the same category as the delegates. I think they also come from the more prestigious schools, and often I think there's a bit of, what do they call it, the revolving door. They sort of go do the NGO job for a few years, and they go in, then perhaps they move in to representing their countries in the delegations. So it's more often when you have, it's the smaller NGOs that were set up, that haven't got so much money behind them, and their representatives tend to be sort of more just regular people who, for whatever reason, have taken an interest in the subject at hand, either deliberately or maybe they've been a victim of some violation, whatever, and that has spurred them into setting up their own NGO. So they're often their delivery, their style of speech, it's going to be less polished, shall we say, more rough and ready than the delegates from the countries, and this is reflected in sometimes from some of the vocabulary they use. Some of the vocabulary will be of a lower register. Also, they won't, sometimes when they speak, it's can be faster, more monotone. They're a bit nervous. They haven't got quite the coolness, shall we say. They're not, they don't do it as part of their everyday job, speaking before the cameras, as often a lot of the delegates will. So there are a few stylistic differences that tend to make your job a little bit harder when you do them as opposed to when you're doing the delegations. Now, the big opportunity for these NGOs to speak, or one of the big opportunities, is at the Universal Periodic Review. That's certainly my work where I encounter them most. And the example, what we're going to be doing today, it's actually the Universal Periodic Review of the country of Niger. Okay, that's how you pronounce it, Niger. People from Niger, I call them Nigerians. Okay, not so Nigerians from the country of Nigeria, but from Niger, I call them Nigerians. I think that's how you're meant to pronounce it. If there's anyone else from here, from Niger, anyone out there watching from Niger, if I'm wrong, please do tell me in the comments. Please do let me know. And now what we're doing is, this was from September last year. It was there, as I say, Universal Periodic Review, UPR, or EPU, as they say in French. And what happens is the country makes their big presentation at the start of the meeting. The other countries then come back and give their feedback. They say what what the country has done well in, what it's not doing so well in. They make recommendations and so on. And then once the member states have made their comments, usually, it's about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, then the turn is given to the NGOs to have their say. So here is where you'll have a lot of maybe these local or regional NGOs speaking. And thankfully, for the most part, they do provide their text. So the ones we'll be working with, I've got 5, got quite a selection of different NGOs speaking, okay? And as usual, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave in the description box below the links so you can actually go and listen to those statements. You can give them a try first of all, see if you can handle them, okay? And then record yourself doing them, and then come back and watch the episode, because there's a lot of interesting vocabulary that is applicable much more broadly than to just the country of Niger. The themes they touch on, the themes are much more universal than, as I say, just for the country of Niger. And so, yeah, we've got 4 or 5 different ones. Some are, a couple of them are bigger NGOs, but also there are NGOs that are much smaller, and so with a speaker it's much harder to follow. So with that introduction for you, let us move on then to the text. And as I say, I will provide also a link to all the transcripts that you're going to be seeing in front of you. So the first NGO speaker that I have for you, there you go, you should be able to see it up on the screen. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Some of these NGOs, one other characteristic is that often they'll have very long, complicated names. And you need to really follow, one tip I'll give you, really follow very closely what the president of the Human Rights Council, whatever it is saying when he's introducing them, to make sure you have the name of the organization written down in front of you. And if you miss it, okay, often they will start their statements by saying, let's say, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom believe this, that, and the other. And what happens if you've missed it? Because it happens. Trust me, it happens. So if that happens to you, one way of getting around it, rather than panicking, is to say something like, our organization believes, or sometimes they'll be speaking on behalf of a whole group of different organizations, in which case, again, you just have to think on your feet and say, our group of organizations believe this, that, and the other. That's just a little tip for you there. Okay, so if you look at the text here, now what you'll notice, okay, déclaration orale sur l'époux du Niger. Okay, so the first, so child marriage, mariage précoce, mariage forcé. Forced marriage. Okay, so these are all 3 phenomena, shall we say, that it's useful just to know, child marriage, early marriage, forced marriage. Now, when you come to listening to the audio, you'll notice that for whatever reason, this first, you can see these brackets here, she skips this bit, the speaker, and the first thing you hear is WILPF Niger accueille donc l'acceptation. So I don't know maybe there was a problem with the audio, maybe it cut out for the first sentence. Okay, we'll just look at what she says though anyway. So the reservations made by Niger to Articles 2 and 16 de la CEDEF. Okay, that's an important thing to know. That's CEDAW, okay? Comité sur l'élimination de la discrimination à l'encontre des femmes. So that's the French acronym. I haven't heard it used that much, but CEDEF is CEDAW, Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Continues to faire obstacle. So that's just, in English, we would just say that in one word, really, wouldn't we? I think impede or to hamper. Again, I always have my package of 3, hamper, hinder, and impede. Okay, I always remember them because they're all close in the alphabet. H, and I. Okay, hamper, hinder, and impede. They impede the adoption of effective measures against marriage of girls, early marriage, and forced marriage. And this, despite the acceptance by Niger in previous cycles of 19 UPR recommendations urging it to lift its reservations. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, if this is the first episode of mine that you've watched. So what happens, as I say, is that at the UPR, the other member states, they make recommendations to the countries, and it's up to the country under review, Niger in this case, to decide whether or not they want to accept the recommendations, reject them, or to take note of them. I think those are the three categories. They can accept, reject, or take note. Sort of take note is a bit of a willy-nilly thing in between. They say, oh, okay, fair enough. Well, maybe we'll do it. Maybe we won't. Urging it to retirer ses réserves. Now, this is just, it's one of these sort of procedural expressions that it's good to be comfortable with. Obviously, you get that a lot at the UN, these procedural expressions, where there's not really much you can do in terms of playing around with it. It's just good to know. You want to lift, if you have reservations, a country has reservations to a document, you can lift those reservations. And you can withdraw them as well, actually. You can lift or withdraw. WFP Niger therefore welcomes the acceptance of recommendations 122.23 and 0.24. For those of you who specifically are going to be doing the UPR one day, the key number here is the second number, okay? The 122 it's always going to be, this is the report number 122, okay? So it's recommendations 23 and 24. Under the if I was doing this meeting and they were going fast, I would just be focusing on just getting, they say 122.23. I would just be focusing on what comes after the point. Urging Niger to lift its reservations and calls for immediate implementation thereof. Okay, then she keeps repeating the WILPF Niger. So here, you could maybe just say, our organization or we. I think it's legitimate now to break it to go to we, because it's a bit of a mouthful, the name of that organization, right? So we welcome the acceptance of recommendations 232, 236 and 241 on adopting a law interdisant strictement, strictly prohibiting, strictly outlawing, banning. It's good to have, say, three synonyms for that, for interdire, prohibit, ban, outlaw. Child marriage and raising the age of marriage to 18 for girls. Niger continues to have the highest rate of marriage of girls in the world, a rate which risks increasing with the COVID pandemic. Et ne peut plus attendre pour prendre des mesures. Okay, and here maybe you'd want to put a full stop, say, put a full stop, then you can just say it is urgent to take strong legislative measures in that field. Education of girls. Okay, our organisation welcomes the acceptance by the government of recommendations 188, 199 and 224 to take all necessary measures or steps to bolster the right to high quality education for all. Okay, éducation de qualité. So you want to in English, you want to throw in the high quality education for all, in particular for girls. WILPF reiterates that education of girls cannot be properly improved until coercive measures are taken to eradicate child marriage. Participation of women in political and public life. WILPF welcomes the acceptance by the government of recommendation 227, or just visant à la, just on implementing in practice a law allocating 25% of elected posts. Okay, so as in those positions that you reach via election, and 30% of post nominative is basically just appointments. I would say for that, post nominative of appointments to women. The quota law must, however, be accompanied by sanctions. Être assorti, okay, be accompanied by. That's a word in my early career that I maybe struggled with a little bit. To assure its respect, and so a law establishing equality at all levels in political and public fora, accompanied by effective sanctions, must also be adopted. Conflict prevention and implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. That's an important concept, okay, to know. I've mentioned this many times. It all revolves around, as you'll see, Security Council Resolution 1325. That's the important document to remember there. Niger accepted recommendation 203 on promoting participation of women in peace processes and in conflict prevention. The government must allocate financial, human and material resources necessary for implementing the 1325 National Action Plan in partnership with civil society. We welcome the acceptance of Recommendation 94, calling on Niger to intensify its efforts to protect civilians living in areas affected by violent conflict, and Recommendations 107, 102 and 112 on establishing measures to combat sexual and gender-based violence. Those two often come as a package, okay? Sometimes it's known as SGBV. And that's an acronym you can use, okay? Sexual and gender-based violence. Niger must place particular emphasis on GBV. So this is basé sur le genre, okay, without the sexual here. And other violations of human rights perpetrated against women and girls by bringing the perpetrators to justice, traduisons justice, bringing to justice, or alternatively holding accountable the perpetrators, including among the security forces, and guaranteeing protection and indemnisation, compensation, okay, and a rehabilitation for the victims. And that's the first one. Actually, just so when you come to do it, you'll notice the style. This is quite a difficult one to do. I wrote here in the notes, patchy and skips. So patchy, as it's done remotely. The speaker is speaking from, via the platform, and skips certain parts of the text. So often sometimes with these texts from the NGOs, okay, you think you've got the text, but you've still got to be very careful. Like with this one, she does sort of skip here and there, so it's important to try and follow it. So that's the first one now. Second one we've got here. Let's see here, I've good audio. So this is quite a good one to do. International Service for Human Rights. Okay, so let's see how we do this one. Thank you, President. This is a joint declaration. So here, this is, as you can see here, he's speaking on behalf of here. If you look down, International Service for Human Rights and Collectif des Organisations de Défense des Droits de l'Homme de la Démocratie, and then you got this long acronym. So again, just be careful, think of it, if he actually then suddenly reads out the full name of this organisation, just think, the organisations we represent believe, blah, blah, blah. During son second passage à l'examen périodique universel. Here I would probably just say during its second UPR. So in the French, they like to use this passage à l'examen. No. So I think in English you can just really synthesize that down to during its second UPR. Just leave out the passage, forget the passage. L'État du Niger, you can probably just leave l'État out. Niger accepted recommendations on creating and maintaining a safe environment, one that was conducive to activities of civil society. So I think for favorable, I think that's conducive is better than favourable in English. Through the respect by the government of the rights to freedom of association, peaceful assembly and expression. So those are an important set of rights, okay? We often, again, come as a package. As well as lifting restrictions to these freedoms. We commend the willingness of the government d'achever to complete the process of adopting a law on protection of defenders, human rights defenders that they're talking about in Niger, prioritizing the education of girls through the creation d'internats. So I had to look, I wasn't 100% certain, so I had to look this up. So I think boarding schools is, I think, what he's getting at. Of boarding schools to keep them at school so as to combat early marriage. I think un cursus scolaire, just the idea is to keep them at school. Nevertheless, we want to reiterate that detentions linked to the recent electoral crisis, rather that detainees linked to the recent electoral crisis remain in prison. Une évaluation. I tend to talk about assessments, okay? Evaluation always sounds a bit odd to me in English. An assessment through un faisceau de documents. Now, I think faisceau is like a light beam. But I think in English we talk about through the lens, okay? Through the lens of documents in particular. So, lens, for this, in this context, when you're assessing something through a given lens. In particular through legal sources, documents relating to human rights, and the work of CSOs, okay, Organisation de la Société Civile, that's an acronym you can use, civil society organizations, CSOs, show that the Niger government has only partially implemented a certain number of recommendations regarding civic space. The government, just get rid of en effet, under these sort of circumstances, that sort of expression can go. The government has been unable to remedy unjustified restrictions on the civic space since its last review. Persecution of defenders, human rights defenders, HRDs you can call them, continues in a national context rongé par l'insécurité. So if you really want to get the nuance of the rongé, maybe you would say, maybe in English we'd say something like, in a national context, marred by insecurity. I'm okay. Literally, it means like eroded by, in a national context, eroded by insecurity linked to terrorism. But kind of that's the kind of word that, if you had to come up with it just in the moment, I, for one, would be struggling. So I'd be looking for just a sort of neutral full word to fall back on. So I'd probably just say in a national context, marked by insecurity linked to terrorism and the COVID pandemic. We remain concerned by the restrictive nature of the law on répression. Okay, so on they use the répression in French more than I think we do in English. So my immediate, again, fallback, if I hear répression de la cybercriminalité, I would probably revert to suppression, on the law on suppression of cybercrime. Although if you had the moment, if you had the text and could prepare it, we'd probably say the restrictive nature on the law on combating cybercrime. I don't like the law repressing cybercrime. It doesn't sound quite right in English, you see. So if you hear répression, I think a valid fallback option is just to make it suppression, if you can't think of anything better. Okay. Adopted in July 2019. The state s'est servi de cette loi, has drawn on this law to pursue certain activists for defamation by means of electric communication. S'est servi, maybe you could say the state has resorted to this law. That's why we call on Niger to end all forms of harassment against HRDs and to unconditionally release defenders, activists, and journalists who've been arrested and held in Niger. Okay, so the release from prison. I think we liberate countries, but I think we release prisoners. And to accelerate procedures for the adoption and, well, you can say promulgation. Often when I hear promulgation, I don't tend to talk about enactment. I like to talk about procedures for adoption and enactment of the national law for protection of human rights defenders. Okay, so that's the second one. Now, next one, number 3. So I just seem to remember for that number 2, that second one, that one we've just done, the speaker is good audio. I think he might be quite a tricky speaker, though. It's quite challenging. seem to recall. This third one then, this is Rado. Now this is, I say, good audio, good slow speaker. So Rado, I think, is one of the is a bigger NGO. It's not a local one. And there you go. It stands for, if you can see it. There we go. Rencontre africaine pour la défense des droits de l'homme. So they speak a lot. They're very active at the Human Rights Council. RADO. Okay, it's good just to recognise them. You don't have to change the acronym or anything like that. So President Rado wants to congratulate Niger for holding presidential, legislative, local elections, peaceful elections. Okay, so I didn't expect the peaceful to be coming, right? So that's, remember, these little small techniques on how to just on how to keep your interpretation flowing without correcting yourself. Okay, so that's one of the techniques. You just repeat the noun. So I said, Rado wants to congratulate Niger for holding presidential, legislative, and local elections, peaceful elections in 2020 and 2021, rather than having to repeat the whole thing for organising peaceful presidential, legislative, and local elections. I'm sort of correct. I have slightly adjusted what I said initially, but it came through in such a way as it didn't sound like I was correcting myself. That's an important technique to be able to master as an interpreter. Since the second review, Niger has made huge steps, made huge progress in the sphere of human rights, particularly with the ratification of several international legal instruments, the amendment to the Rome Statute of the ICC, Cour Pénale Internationale, you can call that the ICC, the Convention on the Protection of the Children. I don't know if he's meaning there on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the CRC. He might be, anyway. As well as adoption of measures on judicial reform for better couverture juridictionnelle dans le pays, for better jurisdictional coverage around the country. For this expression, I'd probably play it pretty safe. And maybe just say for better judicial or even just jurisdictional coverage in the country. I think what he means, the speaker, is that the courts, the judicial system is able to reach more remoter parts of the country than it did before. I think that's what he's getting at. But I wouldn't do anything fancy with that expression. I'd just say something like, judicial coverage in the country. Efforts have been made in the sphere of healthcare, combating poverty, or the efforts made in the sphere of poverty and combating poverty should be commended, welcomed, applauded. So good to have synonyms there. And this despite the terrorist threats which considerably affect the country. However, Rado remains troubled by the high number of early marriages, domestic violence, domestic and gender-based violence. So I think in English, for violence conjugale, violence within the marriage, we tend to call that domestic violence. Et sexiste, I think this is basically to do with gender, basé sur la genre, but I think it comes to the same thing. So I personally would say domestic and gender-based violence, as well as discrimination against women in terms of the right to succession and inheritance. Also, I think in English, so inherit, you want to be getting the idea of inheritance, and I think that's the key word here. The idea of women being allowed to inherit the estate. Okay, that's another good word to know in that context. When someone dies, then they leave all their assets, whatever, to the wife or children. That we say in English that's their estate. So maybe if you want to have two words there, their rights to inheritance and to estate. Just remember those two words when the speaker is discussing that subject. In conclusion, Rado urges Niger to bolster its cooperation with special procedures and the treaty bodies, and to update its initial and periodic reports. Okay, so special procedures. These are just mechanisms within the Human Rights Council, for those of you that are new to this kind of thing. The treaty bodies, these organes de traité, I think that's a misprint, it should be just traité with an S rather than an R, are all all the conventions, all the committees linked to the big UN conventions, like the right of the child convention, the CEDAW that we mentioned earlier, Convention Against Torture. These are all the treaty bodies. Efforts are also needed to combat surpopulation carcérale. That's an important notion to be comfortable with. Prison overcrowding and poor detention conditions. Maybe substandard for bad detention conditions. Bad doesn't sound like the sort of thing we'd say in English. I think in English, the sort of bureaucratic expression would be, substandard, below par detention conditions. Rado urges Niger to ratify the second optional protocol. Okay, you hear a lot of talk about optional protocols when you talk about the treaty bodies. To the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on Abolishing the Death Penalty. Pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques. That's one of the two big covenants, okay? So there's one on civil and political rights, and the other, and so it's not a pact, okay? It's not a pact, it's a covenant in English. And the other one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So those are the two packages. You have civil and political on the one hand, economic, social and cultural on the other. Finally, Rado urges the international community to support Niger in combating the terrorism which threatens its sovereignty. I thank you. Okay, number 4 then. SOS Village d'Enfants. So what I said here about the speaker, tricky, the audio is not very good on this, very tinny sound. That's his tricky sound, very tinny. Speaker okay, but quite fast. So he's quite, I think he is a good speaker, but he goes quite quickly, and there's a bit of, because the sound is poor, there's some moments where the words will be sort of sound slightly slurred. Focus on minimizing number of words. Yeah, so in this one, it's really crucial that you're able to listen to as much as you can and speak as little as possible. That's what was really the impression I had from this. You want to be able to take in as much of what you're saying and then render it in as few words as possible. And what it means is your delivery is going to come out it's going to be rather staccato, okay? It's going to be a bit like this. Okay, but that's the way. That's just the best way of doing it. I think that's just going to be the way to convey the most amount of information, and you just have to adapt your style to the circumstances, to the conditions. If you're lucky, perhaps your team leader might say, no, the audio in this is just too poor, it can't be done. The interpreters are not going to interpret this statement, which does happen quite a lot. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar, if you're working on the market, this does happen, where the quality is simply too substandard. Okay, President, SOS Village d'Enfants in Niger is pleased that states have extended several recommendations on the rights of the child to the Nigerian government. We applaud the commitment de ce dernier of the government to ensure their effective implementation. We congratulate the government. See, if I was doing this, I'd be dropping that Niger, because we know that we're talking about the Niger government. It goes without saying. On accepting recommendations concerning registration of births of children risking being stateless. Okay, apatride is to do with statelessness. Okay, that's an important concept to be aware of. And again, under the conditions, given the way I remember he was speaking, à cet égard, I'd be dropping that, okay? We recommend they take tangible steps for effective registration of births, including for children born to unknown parents, parents inconnus, to ensure their right to a name and nationality. We urge the Justice Ministry to establish a decree defining clear procedures to facilitate access to nationality, or you can say citizenship, as if you don't want to say nationality, as a synonym, for children born in Niger to unknown parents and to unaccompanied children. Again, par ailleurs, I would probably be dropping this. Trust me, when you come to doing this statement, you'll see why. We welcome the acceptance of recommendations on improving the socio-economic well-being of the population. L'atténuation des effets de la pandémie de COVID-19, I would just say mitigating the effects of the pandemic. I would probably just drop COVID-19 because, again, we all know there's only one pandemic in town. And the protection of the rights of vulnerable persons. The pandemic has compounded the causes for separation of children from their families. So it's made things worse, right? You want as synonyms, to compound, to exacerbate. Again, dans ce contexte, these little words at the start of the paragraphs, you can just, I'd be tempted just to leave them out, just to give you that little bit more time to listen and to speak. So we recommend to the government to bolster support to the most vulnerable families. Again, en particulier, they need to ensure that the withdrawal of a child from its family environment be a last resort, une mesure de dernier recours, a last resort measure, a last resort. Aussi, I would get rid of that. We encourage the government to establish a range of options for care which meet the specific needs of each child. We stress the importance of establishing a regulatory framework for formalising the placement of children in host families. De plus, all these, this is one thing I'm taking as I'm doing it. See, when you're under a lot of pressure, these little expressions at the start of sentences, ainsi earlier on, we could probably get rid of that, right? À cet égard, par ailleurs, dans ce contexte, en particulier, aussi, de plus, just leave them out. To support the work of NGOs which provide support to vulnerable families and to children without parental protection, we urge the government to establish a fund, a dedicated fund in the form of government subsidies. In conclusion, we call on the government to prioritise socio-professional integration of youth who have left. Now, I had to look this expression up here, okay? La protection de remplacement. Wasn't certain at all what that was. I've looked up on Lingui, and it seems to be talking about alternative care is what that bit of jargon means. So that would make the sentence read, we urge the government to prioritise the social professional integration of youth who have left alternative care. It should guarantee low-cost access for youth to teaching programs and scholarships, both scholarships, and facilitate their access to job opportunities. I thank you. So there's a new expression that I said. I hadn't heard this before. La protection de remplacement. And it seems to be that the corresponding jargon in English is alternative care. So I guess it's kids maybe who've been taken, who were taken away from their families or didn't, that were maybe put in foster care, that were placed in homes and so on. So the lesson to be drawn from this text, particularly based on the quality of the audio, as you will see, is to actually keep what you say to a minimum, and really here just drop these slightly redundant expressions as you're going along, the ainsi, the à cet égard, the en particulier, etc. Which brings us then to our final text here, which is from an organization called CECID, Centre du Commerce International pour le Développement. Quite a short one. I think the audio for this was pretty good. Okay, let's see what they have to say. President, it is with satisfaction that CECID welcomes the presentation of Niger's report at its third UPR. I'd be inclined to just drop the cycle at its third UPR, which followed exhaustive consultations with a group of civil society actors, stakeholders. They like that word at the UN, stakeholders as well, instead of actor. I think actors is okay. Maybe stakeholders is a register up, shall we say. At its second review, Niger made qualitative and quantitative changes in the field of human rights. These changes allowed the country to guarantee and ensure l'alternance démocratique. That is just basically democratic change of government. Change of government is the key concept. It's a bit of a mouthful in English, but there's no other real way I don't think that you could express that idea. It's the idea that there are elections, the opposition party wins and moves into government. And that's, change of government to establish good governance. CECID commends Niger for its huge contribution to the adoption of a African free trade zone, as well as its appui constant, its steadfast, its ongoing support to the G5 Sahel. So just FYI, the G5 Sahel, it's an organization you want to be, again, familiar with. If it's, the African states may refer to it in various contexts. So as you can see here, I just found it on Wikipedia. It's an institutional framework for coordination of regional cooperation in development policies and security matters in West Africa. Formed in Nouakchott, Mauritania, at the summit of the 5 Sahel countries, so Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Adopted a convention of establishment in 2014, permanently seated in Mauritania. The military aspect is coordinated by the respective countries' chiefs of staff. So they do play a sort of role at the military level. And I think you see here, so on 1st of August 2014, France launched a counter-terrorism mission, Operation Barkhane, deploying 3,000 soldiers in the member states of the G5 Sahel. On 20th December, G5 Sahel, with the backing of the African Union, called on the UN Security Council to set up an international force to neutralize armed groups, help national reconciliation, and establish stable democratic institutions in Libya. So they are a bit of a player at a regional level, including militarily. So again, like I said, it's worth recognizing them. However, CECID, let's go back here. However, CECID remains profoundly troubled by the security situation in the southwest of the country, where terrorist groups have resorted to forced recruitment. Se livre à, okay, have resorted to forced recruitment of youth, attacks on villages. Now, when I did this, to remind myself, I missed this incendie de grenier. I just skipped it. So they set fire to barns, okay? Extortion, intimidation, and stealing bétail, livestock, okay? I think he's quite a fast speaker. There's quite a lot of detail here, so I just missed the incendie de grenier. Furthermore, CECID noted that the exacerbation of insecurity, the heightening insecurity in the country since January 2021 had gravely impacted the protection of populations and chiefly children who have been victim of mass déscolarisation. So I think we would say school dropout. So scolarisation, okay, we say enrollment. These are two important concepts, whatever that you're talking about, sort of human rights and the idea of improving education, especially in developing countries. Scolarisation, enrollment. This is really the opposite, déscolarisation, dropout, school dropout. And an important synonym to know also for déscolarisation, which I think I tend to hear more than déscolarisation, is abandon, like abandon for dropout. So remember that. Given the current situation, whenever talk about la situation qui prévaut, you don't need to say given the situation that prevails, just given the current situation. CECID takes the opportunity to ask the international community to support Niger's efforts in countering terrorism. La lutte contre le terrorisme, in English, the best expression, way of rendering that is to counter terrorism, but you can also say to combat terrorism. In conclusion, CECID encourages Niger to pursue its efforts to bring its national legislation into line with its commitments and to bolster the integration of human rights into public policy and to establish tangible measures to combat impunity and to reach a national consensus on the abolition of the death penalty. I thank you. So there we have it. We have 5 different NGO statements there covering the situation in Niger. Some of them, they talk about these problems, things like early marriage, forced marriage. It's good to just practice that kind of vocabulary because it is very topical. It's a problem, I guess, in that part of the world. And as I say, it's good. I would seriously advise you to practice some of these just to give yourself so you have a feel for how the delivery, of these sort of NGO speakers sounds, because it's a different challenge that you have with them than you have with the delegates. The thing is, the NGOs are very unlikely ever to stop you. Okay, the NGOs are will very rarely interrupt you and say, no, that wasn't right. So there's kind of a less pressure in that respect, but you still feel obliged. You want to do a good job for them, right? And so it's good to just get more familiar with the style of speech of people from maybe more disadvantaged backgrounds, just to get just so that you feel more comfortable with dealing with some of the accents. I mean, I know at the start, like when I first started working at the UN, a lot of the African countries, for gender, okay, and often in many countries, they say genre. And I remember one statement, and the speaker kept saying genre. I couldn't work out what it was. Gender, genre. So they don't have the same the same accents as perhaps the more educated speakers that work in the delegations. So it's a good skill to add. It's a good. Because these speakers, they do come up a lot, and you need to be able to handle not just the French of the Paris-educated African government official classes. You need to be able to also deal with the French from, as I say, from the plebs, shall we say? Okay, so guys, anyway. I hope you have found that little dip into the world of French-speaking NGOs useful. I think I'm going to try and find one for Spanish NGOs as well. If you have enjoyed the episode, please do click on the like button. Please do share with your friends and subscribe. And I always do appreciate it if you can leave comments down below if there's any new words in particular that you have learned, or if there's anything you want to correct me on from what you've heard in this episode, please do put it in the comments. It's always much appreciated. And really, that's pretty much it for today. So all that leaves me to say then is that episode 123 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.
The train is now leaving the Interpretation Station. We hope you enjoyed your visit. Until next time, folks.